Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behaviour nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behaviour geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behaviour nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behaviour geeks. We will kick off today's episode where I'm excited to engage in a conversation with Jill Fernandes. Dr. Fernandes is an animal welfare scientist and consultant who is dedicated to shaping a better world for animals. Growing up on a farm in Missouri, surrounded by cattle, horses, dogs, cats, foxes, deer, and quail, Jill has a deep-seated interest in the workings of nature and the social behaviour of animals, including humans. Jill has a PhD in environmental science and policy from the Leonard and Jane Abbess Center at the University of Miami. She is a Fulbright Scholar and a Graduate Research Fellow of the National Science Foundation. She undertook scientific research on a number of topics in the Environmental and Animal Sciences Department at the University of Queensland, Australia, before moving into consulting. Through her company Animal Centric, she now writes books and articles about animals, offers courses and workshops, and strategies with zoos and aquariums, farms, and many other organisations with animals under their care, to ensure that all animals live the best lives possible. So without any further delay, I'm thrilled to welcome Jill to our show today. She's patiently standing by. Jill, we are super grateful for you taking time out of your schedule to join us here at the Animal Training Academy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Happy to be here.
All right, let's go ahead and jump right into our first question, Jill.
Mm-hmm.
Could you kindly transport us back to where you first delved into animal behaviour and welfare? We'd love to hear some of your experiences from your journey.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Like you said in the bio, I did grow up on a farm, 50-acre farm in Missouri, which is in the Midwest, the very heartland of the United States, for those of you who aren't aware. And it wasn't a commercial farm. It was what people in the farming industry would call a hobby farm. We had cattle for beef production, but mostly for our own consumption. And then we had horses and dogs, like you said, all the animals you said, cats, and of course, lots of wildlife running around. So growing up on a farm, it is a bit isolating, as many of the people in rural areas would know. You go to school and you spend all day with your classmates, but it's not as easy to catch up with people in the evenings. It's not like my friends who lived in a suburb where they would just go around and play with their neighbors in the evenings. So I spent a lot of time around animals, and animals were my social group, I suppose you could say. So I learned a lot about them and a lot about reading animals and animal behavior. And at the time, I didn't really know that it was an interest. As you are when you're a child, it's just the world you live in. But it grew stronger and stronger as I got older. I remember one of my earliest involvements with animals was in 4th grade, when I started something called the Dog Lovers Club. And this was my first experience of community organizing, which seems to be a recurring theme for me. I I basically got a group of other fourth graders together who were interested in dogs and made them study textbooks on dog anatomy and physiology and dog care. And they would come over and we would do, practice veterinary procedures on stuffed animals. And it was a very serious pursuit. And I was, of course, driving them because I was a crazy little girl. And to learn all of this knowledge about dogs, we just had to learn everything we could about dogs. And part of that was organizing a community event called, I think it was called the Dog Festival or the Dog Lovers Festival, at this wildlife park across the street from where I lived, and hanging up flyers all over the community for this. So lots of people attended this event. I want to say around 100 people brought their dogs, and we had lots of fun events. We were painting dogs' toenails and like dog races. We actually got some pet food companies to come and offer samples. So this was all in the fourth grade. So my parents knew that they had, a mini, I guess, hurricane on their hands with me. And then I actually went on to become a Miami Hurricane at the University of Miami. I studied in the Leonard and Jane Abbess Center. Actually, for my undergrad, I studied microbiology and international relations, which don't seem to go together at all, but it all sort of ties into the human and animal behavior, which has always been two interests of mine. And then I went on to do a PhD at the Leonard and Jane Abbess Center for Ecosystem Science and Policy. And that was because I had met a professor during my undergraduate studies who was a mosquito biologist, and Dr. John Beyer, and he's one of the top mosquito biologists in the world. And he did a lot of studies on Anopheles mosquitoes, which are the species that are responsible for transmitting malaria. And so I saw this sort of interconnection between a tiny animal, mosquito, and understanding their biology and behavior, and ecology, so the environment and the environments in which those mosquitoes thrive, and humans, so people living in villages exposed to these mosquitoes getting malaria, and policy. So the policies that we have to control those mosquitoes make a difference on their populations, which means that they can, spread the diseases more or less depending on how many of them there are. So that was a really fascinating subject to me, the interconnectivity of all these different levels of nature, really. And so it was, an interdisciplinary PhD, I suppose you could say, on mosquito ecology, mosquito biology, and policy to control mosquitoes. So that was my sort of deep dive into animal behavior. I did do some studies on mosquito behavior during my PhD. So I moved to Australia during that PhD, and I finished it off here in Brisbane, and where I now live. And I was really interested in mosquito swarming behavior, which is where mosquitoes form these large swarms. In Africa, apparently, they're massive and you can see them. They're contrasted against the sky. They're for the purpose of mating and copulation. So these swarms form spontaneously, and we don't really understand why or how the mosquitoes decide where to swarm, or we don't understand much about swarms. And part of the reason we don't understand them is because they happen so rarely, especially with non-Anopheles species. So here in Australia, trying to go out and find swarms of mosquitoes was quite challenging, and it involved wading through swamps for a lot of my PhD and trying to capture these spontaneous events. And the idea behind understanding these swarms was to understand mosquito reproduction, because if we can understand mosquito reproduction, maybe we can potentially use that behavior to reduce mosquito populations, which is the goal of this area of animal science. And then, let's see, after that, I finished my PhD, and as I said, there was a policy component, which was how do we control vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue, Zika, yellow fever globally through policies, good policies, and good decision making. And then after that, I went and worked at the University of Queensland as a researcher. I worked within the Queensland Alliance for Agriculture and Food Innovation, QAFI, and I studied a little bit about vector-borne diseases there, because many animals are vectors and suffer from vector-borne diseases. And then I moved into a group with Professor Alan Tilbrook, who's an animal neuroendocrinologist, specifically focusing on livestock. And that sort of introduced me to this world of neuroscience and what goes on inside of animals' heads, and particularly behind their emotions and the way they feel about the world. So that was a really interesting area of research. However, when I was at the university, I was as a researcher there for 5 years. I kept feeling this craving to get out and work with animals again, and to, not just in laboratory settings, but in the real world. And I also saw through my work through the Animal Welfare Collaborative, which is an initiative we started out of the University of Queensland, that a lot of zoos and aquariums, farmers, dog shelters, and other organizations that work with animals could benefit from a lot of the knowledge of animal welfare science. But there weren't a lot of people translating that very complex science into practical actions for them. So that was my idea behind starting my own consulting business, Animal Centric. And the idea behind it is just to keep the animals at the center of the conversation, and really focus on what the animals are experiencing, i.e. their welfare. Yep, that's my journey.
And so help the listeners understand what Animal Centric offers. If you're a manager of a zoo in Australasia, or if you have a hobby farm or a commercial farm, or you're working at a dog shelter, what services would you come in and offer these organizations?
Okay, so Animal Centric offers consulting services to all organizations with animals under their care. So not just zoos and aquariums or farms, but any organization that cares for animals and has a direct responsibility for the welfare of those animals. And we basically go in and work shoulder to shoulder with the organization to look at ways that the welfare of those animals can be improved even further. Generally, most organizations already have some policies and procedures in place to ensure that animals have good welfare. That's part of their business model. But if they're looking to improve welfare even further, or to have an assurance that positive welfare is occurring, then that's something that we do from a strategy level to develop those programs, systems, strategies to ensure that there is positive welfare among the animals. And then we also work at the frontline level, I suppose you could say, working directly with keepers and trainers, and trying to build capacity in those people to understand animals, understand animal welfare, and have a deeper knowledge of it, so that they can adjust their own behavior and the ways that they do things to ensure that animals are living good lives. We also offer workshops and courses, of course, and write articles. And I am writing a book. Well, no, I've written a book.
You've written a book that is commercially available now, or you've written a book that is going through that fun process of being published and all of that stuff?
Second. second part. So the book is written, it's been edited, and now it's going into formatting for publication. So it will be available later in the year.
Cool. What's the book?
It's called Cooperating Through Chaos, Why Humans and Other Animals Work Together. And it's really a deep dive into the cooperative behavior of human beings and other social animals that cooperate with each other. So yes, if you have an interest in animal cooperation, that will be available later this year.
Well, for those who have written a book, and I'm not in that group, but I can appreciate from an outsider looking in how much work that is. So congratulations on the approximation that you're up to in terms of having written it and it going through the editing process. That's exciting.
Yeah, thank you. This one took a long time. This one is my first book for public circulation. I wrote a book previously after doing 2 years of interviews with a Holocaust survivor in Miami. I wrote a book, his biography for him and his immediate family. But that one's not for public distribution because he wanted to keep it within his family. So I had to respect that. But this is the first public distribution book. So it took me 3 years to write because I'm a perfectionist. And yeah, it is a lot of work, but I'm hoping the next book will be a little bit quicker, hopefully.
There's likely people out there who are thinking the same as me. You were at university doing your studies, following your academic journey, and you just had time to write a book for a family, which seems like another whole full-time job. But being a fourth grader and organizing 100 people to come to a community event, there is something unique about your drive and your output and your practical application and what actually gets materialized out into the world. What is the end goal of animal centric? Like where is your vision? What are you wanting to materialize next?
So my end goal for animal centric is very, very, modest. It's just to shape a better world for animals. So just to change the whole world, basically. To make it better suited for animals. My belief is that animals don't need to change. I mean, I'm talking about non-human animals. We human animals need to change our behavior and the way we're treating the planet and the way we're treating animals to make the world better for them. Because they're very well adapted to nature. And I think we've imposed some constraints on them sometimes that make it difficult for them. In particular, I'm talking about pollution. Especially, I'm very concerned about the state of the ocean in particular. And so I'm very passionate about all the conservation efforts people are doing and all the science out there to help clean up the ocean and to help conserve those populations of animals. But that's my goal. So it's part animal welfare, part environmental. To be they're one and the same. It's the welfare of animals under our direct care and under our influence, which would be those animals in the wild. So yeah, my goal is that they can live the best lives possible.
Right. So let's stick with zoos and aquariums and think that you're listening to this podcast and you are an accredited organization in our region and you're curious about what kind of policies might you suggest to an organization to improve welfare and what kind of practical changes can frontline staff keepers on the ground make. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people roll their eyes at the word policy, and because it sounds really boring, and I can totally understand that because having studied policy documents and as part of my PhD, I can totally get why people roll their eyes. It is boring. It can be boring. Also, strategic plans and things like those, which are policy documents, some people roll their eyes because they say this is too ambitious and this isn't actually what we're going to do. But to me, those are ineffective policy documents. So real policies, good policies, should describe the intention of the organization. in clear words, clear terms that everybody in the entire organization can immediately get and apply. And so in that way, policy can provide clarity. And clarity is one of the most amazing virtues, I think, because if we're all on the same page, then we can do something about it. Then we can actually take action. So with some of the organizations I've worked with, one of the first steps has been to establish a strategic plan if they didn't already have one. And I know that can sound like a fluff document, but it's not if it's actually coming from the intentions, the real intentions of the people who work in the organization. So, for instance, interviewing all of the keepers and trainers involved with animals and saying, what do you want for the future of this organization is generally my starting point. And working with the executive as well. I think those needs need to meet in the middle in some ways. We have to look at what the executive wants for the organization, because sometimes they have a longer range vision, and what the people who are working with animals every day want for the organization, because they're thinking about it. Whether you realize it or not, they are thinking about it. And so they have ideas. So let's capture those ideas, let's distill them, and let's get everybody on the same page. So a basic strategy, I think, is fundamental for improving animal welfare over the long term. So that would be one of the first things I would suggest. But then after that, how do you apply that strategy? So we can't just develop a strategy and leave it, which is a mistake that many organizations make because they get busy. It's understandable. But how do we develop sub-goals out of that strategy, and how do we measure those goals to know whether we're achieving them from year to year? Because ultimately those sort of accountability systems, which is something I'm a big believer in, are what guarantee that animal welfare is improving, or that it should be improving, that our care is improving. To know whether animal welfare is improving, we have to ask the animals. So again, if there isn't a system for observing animals systematically, then I would definitely suggest that as well. Most zoos and aquariums do this sort of anecdotally anyway. I mean, it's part of keepers and trainers' jobs to observe the animals. But actually recording those behaviors and analyzing them can be beneficial to know whether animal welfare is actually improving over time or not. So those are some of the policy things that I'm involved with. Also, decision tools. So one of the things that I've been involved with is developing sort of calculators to help keepers and trainers make decisions about very complex things. This is something I'll be presenting at the Zoos and Aquariums Association conference in New Zealand in August, is a calculator that we've developed with SeaWorld Australia to help them make better decisions around dignity, respect, and welfare. So when there's a particular thing, any issue really, say we're doing a guest interaction with an animal and a keeper has a concern, or a guest has a concern that this isn't respectful or this is bad for welfare, we don't like it for some reason, then they can run this through a calculator, which is a decision-making tool that actually is based on the values that SeaWorld has developed as a group through a values probing workshop. So it's not just we have our values and it's on our website and it's, it's there for everyone to see, but it's how do we apply these values in action? And the way we apply it is on every decision we make. And so putting it through this calculator means you can take a simple decision like, is this certain behavior that we're having the animals do, is it dignified or not? That's a very fuzzy question. Normally, we could sit and debate it all day long. But as an organization, SeaWorld has decided these are our values. This is what we think dignity means, according to what the international community thinks and what we think, having worked with the animals. And so we're going to hold ourselves accountable to our own criteria. And we're going to put it through this calculator and say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no to all these questions. And at the end, it's going to spit out an answer that says, look, this behavior is great for welfare. but dignity-wise, it's not so great. So maybe we would need to review how we communicate about this behavior to guests to make it more dignified. So those are the sort of basically from strategy, high-level strategy down to very applied. That's sort of how animal-centric works.
And when you say calculator, is it like a digital form, or is it just a physical form you fill out in?
It's an Excel-based form.
Wow,
yeah.
Cool.
So I do a lot in Excel. I kind of think in Excel. I feel like some people think in the format of spreadsheets, and basically all my ideas when I get them after I've, sort of jotted them down on paper, I'll put them into Excel because, it allows me to think in at least 2 dimensions.
Well, I got lots of questions, but in the interest of time, we're going to push on. Can you tell those listening, though, where they can go to find out more about animal-centric and get in touch?
Yes. So you can go to our website, which is www.animal-centric.com. The dash is actually a hyphen. I have to say that, or my high school English teacher will be upset. But yes, whether you call that simple a dash or a hyphen, it's animal-centric.com. And it's centric, CENTRIC.com.
Awesome. And we will link to this in the show notes as well, so you can find it on the ATA website. Jill, we're greatly appreciative of you sharing everything so far. It's always fascinating to hear about someone's learning odyssey in behavioral studies, so huge thank you for sharing all of that. Doing our best to ensure positive welfare states for our animals and meeting their needs is, of course, as we've been talking about, of paramount importance. Achieving good welfare, however, can be, as we just talked about, a few factors and variables, a complex undertaking, largely because, as we've also been talking about, words and one word being welfare can hold different meanings for different human individuals, but you've talked about getting clarity and the importance of that. But you've also talked about, from the animal's perspective, we could argue a positive welfare state really retains a singular, unambiguous definition. While humans can offer an array of opinions about animal welfare, if we truly seek answers, we must turn to the animals themselves. It's through their behavior, responses, and other data that we can evaluate whether we're adequately meeting their needs. But how do we effectively communicate with these animals to ascertain their welfare status? How do we ask the animal, so to speak? Figuring this out for someone listening and who works in a zoo or a shelter or on a farm can be totally stressful and overwhelming. What you've all said makes sense, but where do they start? Which brings us to a fascinating question. What does asking the animal actually mean? We are incredibly fortunate to have you with us today, Jill, to answer this and enlighten us on this intriguing concept by sharing 3 unique approaches that enable us to ask the animals if we are successfully meeting their needs from a welfare perspective. Can you get us started, please, with number 1?
Yes. So as you said, Ryan, there are a lot of different meanings that we humans ascribe to the term animal welfare, but to the animals, it only means one thing. And I think this is important for clarity's sake, because one of the common roadblocks I see in applied animal welfare science is that people say, well, it's subjective. We can't really know what they're feeling, so why are we even trying? Why are we even trying to know what they feel? We'll never know. We'll never know what it's like, to be a walrus. So why are we trying? Why do we care? But really, animals give us the answer there. And it boils down to a single word in my mind, which is experience. So animal welfare is what animals experience. It's not what we think about it. And it's not what we provide them. So that's good care. We can provide them lots of enrichment, varied diets, really good quality diets, great enclosures, but that's care. What the output is what the animal experiences inside within them. We all have experiences every day, positive and negative. And those experiences are defined within the animal. So we don't define them as positive or negative, the animal does. These are related to positive and negative emotions that the animal feels. And emotions are an evolutionary adaptation that allow us to judge and respond to our environment. So if we, for instance, are in a situation and we feel fear, that's our body's way of protecting ourselves from that similar environment. And in that way, I feel that emotions and learning are interconnected, experiential learning, that is. So when we learn from our experiences, we learn because we experience it as rewarding or aversive, positive or negative. So that's something that's happening within the animal's nervous system. It's not something that we humans see from the outside and say, oh, that's positive or negative. It's defined by the animal. And so in that regard, we can tell what an animal's feeling by what they do to a certain extent, especially by what they are drawn to and what they avoid. At a very basic level, if an animal is drawn to something, then we can sort of assume that it's positive for that animal. The animal wants it. If an animal is avoiding something or withdrawing from something, we can assume cautiously that that's a negative thing for the animal. We may not know why, and it may have multiple causes. So it may be that the animal doesn't like that food. It may be that that food made the animal sick once, or it may be that there's another conspecific, another animal in that group that is, threatening that animal so much that they feel too scared to approach the food. So we don't know. We can just say it's negative. So in that regard, I think it's very easy in a sense for people working with animals to understand what animals experience. We can't say whether it's fear or whether it's anxiety or whether it's depression or whether it's sadness or if it's anything like we experience those emotions or what we would call them, because even between humans, we would give different definitions to the same emotion, right? But we can say it's either positive or negative. We want it or we don't want it. And I think that's good enough. So experience is animal welfare. It's also been described within the 5 domains framework by David Miller as mental state. And to me, that's the same as experience. So experience and mental state are equivalent in my mind. So that's why we need to ask the animal, because animal welfare is defined by the animal, defined by each individual animal. So how do we do it in a practical sense? I would say there are 3 key steps to asking the animal. So the first step is to understand the natural history of the animal. So this is really important because we can't interpret their behavior unless we understand or even know what they might need unless we know about their natural history. So I would suggest to anyone about to work with an animal, look into the natural history of that species, first of all. So a few questions I would ask myself if I'm dealing with a species I've never dealt with before is I would look into the evolution of that species. So under what circumstances did this species evolve historically, going back, way back? If it's a mammal, let's look at where mammals started to diverge and what other sorts of animals did this animal diverge from. And if it's not a mammal, then what did it diverge from? What are its closest ancestors? Or what are its closest relatives you can look at? Especially species about which we don't know much, we have to sort of fill in the gaps. And so one of the best ways we can fill in the gaps is by looking at closely related species, either genetically related or occupying the same environment, the same niche. Because what is it that shapes our evolution? It's our environment. Our environment shapes us. So we want to try to understand what types of environments does this animal inhabit normally in the wild? That's another important component. So look at the evolution, but also look at the current distribution of this species. What types of climate do they live in? What is the topography of that environment? Are there lots of trees, for instance? Are there lots of other animals? Are there lots of other species? What types of food do they eat within that environment, and how do they acquire that food? So just basic animal needs. And you can use the 5 domains framework to kind of, as a blueprint or as an outline, to research each of these topics. And there's a lot on the internet about it. Even if you don't have access to certain journal articles you may want, there's a lot that's been written out there about many of the species, not all. One of the best resources is the AZA husbandry manuals for species that are kept in zoos and aquariums. But again, it's out there in many different sources on the internet. Another thing that you might want to consider is the species predator or prey? Because sometimes this can give you a lot of clues about their behavior. And, prey species, a lot of times their behavior can be quite masked because they're trying to hide in their environment, right? So if they're upset about something, they're not just going to go off about it. They're not going to make lots of noise and things like that, or become particularly overtly aggressive. They might shut down because for them, that's been an adaptation that was protective. Or they might, their go-to might be herding together, which again is something that I explore in my book on cooperation. But some animals, their instinct is to herd together. I know this is the case for elephants. When they experience something unknown, a lot of times they'll cluster closer together and they'll actually sort of herd themselves as a way of protecting themselves. And so another thing to understand about the natural history of the animal is how the animal communicates. So how do those animals communicate with each other? Their primary form of communication is probably what we're going to want to look at the most when we're communicating with them. We train animals to communicate with us in all sorts of ways, but if we can use their natural form of communication with each other, that is instinctual and that they already have predisposed tendencies to do as an expression of their emotion to each other, then we're going to get a lot closer to the source of what they're experiencing. So for instance, I learned a lot about reading about my own dog, a basset hound, when I started reading about canine play behavior, because the study of canine play has actually been broken down into very discrete micro behaviors, I suppose you could call it, but even things like the bounciness of his gait, and there's certain postures that dogs will display when they're inviting another dog to play, play bows and things like that. They'll have their mouth open as sort of like an invitation. And so I started noticing these micro behaviors more because I'd read about what canines naturally do when they play with each other. So that can be those sort of social behaviors, social communication can be a great way to understand the animal. So that's, I would say also you want to look at their primary sensory organs. So what is the sense that they most use? And I'm sure this is something you already consider, Ryan, a lot when you're teaching people how to train. But for instance, dogs use primarily their sense or their sense of smell, whereas humans are primarily visual. And so, dolphins communicate with each other through acoustics, through sound. So we can teach them to use visual cues, but perhaps they're better equipped to respond to auditory cues. And the same with dogs. They may not be very good at distinguishing on visual tasks, but if you give them an olfactory task, they might really excel. So these are things we want to keep in mind. What is the species capable of sensing? What do they normally use to sense their environment? At the very least, we want to understand we're all trying to get an understanding of what does the animal need, because that's going to give us a basic idea of care for the animal, right? And what's valuable to them. But also we're trying to get a basic understanding, at the very least, of approach and avoidance. So what does it look like when this animal is approaching something? And what does it look like when the animal's avoiding? So I think one of the cases that really cemented this for me was assessing the welfare of sea jellies. And this can be quite difficult. And when we first had this challenge, I was like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? And But then we brought it back to basics, which is approach and avoid. So we know that sea jellies can capture things as a form of hunting. So we know that they can approach things, right? And we also know that they can recoil and avoid when something is aversive. So apparently I've heard that, even though we don't understand the emotions of jellies very well, if you cut a tentacle on a jelly, they'll recoil pretty quickly, right? So they feel something and they're going to avoid that. So they're moving away. So at a basic level, if you can understand what does it look like if this animal wants something versus doesn't want something, what does it look like if this animal is approaching versus avoiding something? That's the very basics. And it always helps to get information on the individual as well. So if there's other keepers or trainers who've worked with that animal before, that individual animal, and knows things specific to that individual, then that can help you understand their behavior even better. So I would say that's the first step of asking the animal, is understand the natural history of the animal. Learn everything you can about that natural history. Any comments on that, Ryan?
So understanding the natural history helps us ask the animal because it helps us understand their experience, and experience is a synonym for welfare.
That's correct. Yeah.
I am sitting here absorbing it all like a sponge.
Okay. Yeah. So that's the first thing we need to do, is just do a bit of background study, really, about the animal. The more you know about that animal, the better. So don't just read the husbandry manual, read everything you can about that species, and related species, really. Sometimes you can learn interesting things from the behavior of related species. Okay, so once you've done all your study, and again, our study never ends, right? But let's say you're going to work now. You're going to work with the animal. What do we do? One of the things that I know in the training community that they advocate for is to have a clear goal in mind when you're trying to achieve something with an animal. And I think that's really important. Having clarity around that goal is important, and knowing the approximations and the steps that you're going to put into place to get to that goal, and doing that sort of pre-homework before you go and approach the animal is really important. Because the second step of asking the animal, in my mind, is to forget yourself. So that, this is a hard one for most people to swallow. We want to, let's see, how do I explain? Observation is the basis of the scientific method, going back to Aristotle and his scientific method, which is based on science is observation, and then observing nature and interpreting what we observe. So observation, interpretation, over and over and over and over. How do we become good observers? We have to forget ourselves. We have to pretend like we're not there, almost, to eliminate any bias that we might bring into the interaction. So if you come into an interaction with an animal already with an expectation of what that animal is going to do, then you're introducing bias because you want a certain outcome. And this can be really hard for trainers because they do want a certain outcome, because we just said, establish a goal, right? So it's almost like you need to establish that goal and those approximations so well and so clearly that you can almost forget about them, because they're already in the back of your mind. And at the forefront of your mind is nothing at all. So this is really hard, but to be a good observer of animals and to ask the animal, we need to try to become almost dumb. This is the way I frame it to myself, right? Go in dumb, go in, just pretend like you know nothing about that animal, about that individual. Clear all assumptions that you have about that individual. It particularly doesn't help, and this is something we've discovered, that when people assign labels to animals, so like this animal is difficult, or this animal's cranky or flippant or whatever, these can provide a lot of bias to you working with the animal. So try to forget all those labels. And if you're working in a facility, try not to even use those labels in the first place, because they can really bias your interaction with the animal. So forget all labels. Just say, I'm going in to meet this animal and to see what this animal has to say. And for me, the metaphor of becoming dumb works. For other people, a metaphor might be enter with a childlike state. With that childlike wonder. When you're a child, you do go in innocent to every interaction with animals. You don't expect anything of that animal. You just watch in wonder, kind of. And so if we can go in with a childlike state or a blank slate, you could think of it as, or for me, I have to tell myself to be dumb and just, I know nothing about this animal, be dumb. And that helps me to reduce my observer bias that I have. Also, an important point to make here is that it's hard to go in blank if you're carrying a lot of emotional baggage. And so this, or expectations of yourself. So I'll address both. Emotional baggage going into an interaction with an animal can really cloud your thinking. And this is a really big problem in the industries that work with animals, where there's people working directly with animals. And I'm sure you've spoken about this before on your podcast, Ryan, but compassion fatigue is a major problem in these industries working with animals, and really for all people working with animals, because we feel this duty and this sense of responsibility to look after this animal, and who really, we are responsible for all their needs. So that's a huge responsibility, and it's a natural part of working with animals. It's part of the job, compassion fatigue. And I think if it's not addressed periodically and preventatively, it can really snowball, and you can carry that baggage along with you to the point where you really aren't bringing your best self to your interaction with the animal, and you really aren't going to be attuned to that animal's behaviors in the same way that you would if you came in fresh, feeling good. So I think it's important that if you're going to work with animals, that you take good care of yourself and that you always keep a watchful eye for compassion fatigue to creep up, because it will. It will happen over and over and over throughout your life. And it's something we need to prevent and manage in ourselves and recognize in others and help them to manage it. As a community, we need to manage it better. The other thing is expectations that you have of yourself. As someone who's particularly hard on myself, I understand this very much. So it can be easy to be self-critical, especially when you're doing something that matters to you so much. For me, animals matter to me a lot, and I'm so critical of myself when I'm interacting with my dog on a daily basis of my own behavior. But really, we have to recognize that this isn't helpful. If anything, it's clouding our ability to understand the animal's behavior and to ask the animal how they're feeling. I see this a lot with younger trainers who are just starting their career. They really have high expectations on themselves, especially if they know someone else is watching, like their supervisor. They're really just wanting to do a good job. And so they're wanting to achieve, they're wanting to show they can train an animal. And so they have these ridiculously high expectations. And that can really get in the way of reading the animal's behavior and asking the animal. So it's good if you're a supervisor, if you supervise anyone who works with animals, it's important to communicate to them that you're not going to judge them based on their performance of being able to achieve this behavior this quickly. That's not what they're being judged on. They're being judged on, you're going to be judged on how well you respond to the animal, how well you read the animal's behavior and respond your methods accordingly. So that's very important to communicate to young trainers, because they think they're coming in to do a good job, to train these behaviors and to achieve. And we need to stamp that out of them. You are here to observe, and respond and adjust your behavior accordingly. So if you can get rid of that emotional baggage and those expectations and those goals that you have in your head and quiet your mind, then you can put all your focus onto the animal. So that brings us to our third step, which is pay attention. Pay attention to the animal from moment to moment. And especially the closer attention you can pay to micro behaviors, the better. So often, when we look at ethograms of animals, we're looking at very broad categories of behaviors. So observing and recording behaviors like sleeping, walking, resting, eating, things like that. But when you're working one-on-one with an animal and you're trying to interpret how that animal's experiences, what that animal's experience is, you need to look at more subtle behaviors because the animal's there. You could just say the animal's right in front of you. Oh, the animal's attentive. Great. But how are you going to notice that slight bit of discomfort, that slight bit of hesitation to do something that you've asked? How are you going to notice those approach and avoid behaviors on a very micro level unless you just pay attention from moment to moment on the most microscopic level that you can? So you'll notice good trainers do this instinctively. They watch the animal's eyes, like depending on the animal, right? But some animals express a lot of emotion in their eyes, where their gaze is, what they're looking at. So a lot of animals who use their eyes as a primary sensory organ, their gaze can tell you a lot about where their headspace is. We actually use this, or it's actually been used in human decision science, eye tracking software that can look at where the eyes are going, where they're moving, how long they're gazing there, and even how big the pupil is dilating. Because pupil size is related to our physiological response and our stress response. So there's a lot you can gain just by looking at the eyes of an animal. And sometimes squinting, for instance, can be indicative of how the animal is feeling. If it's not the eyes, it might be just sudden movements of the head, just little things, sudden movements of their fins. Again, what you did in step 1 of understanding the natural history of the animal is going to tell you what you should be paying the most attention to in step 3 of paying attention. So that is going to really inform what you look at. And the more subtle you can attune yourself to notice, the better. And yeah, respond. I mean, pay attention and respond and experiment, and the animal will tell you how the animal is feeling. They'll tell you through their behavior, because their behavior, as Dr. Sudman Friedman has so beautifully said, is their way of controlling outcomes. And they're trying to control the outcome, whether you think they are or not. So read their behavior, listen to their behavior. Let's ask the animal what they want. And read their response through their behavior. That's the only means they have of communicating with us. So we need to be very, very good at observing and interpreting behavior. That's our job, our main job as people who work with animals. And that's the primary way that we have of reading their welfare from moment to moment and ultimately improving it.
I loved your answers. They weren't what I expected. They were
Really?
but not in a bad way. They were just so training related.
Oh.
Especially that last one anyway. Remind me of a recent episode we did with Amy Shields from Cheyenne Mountain Zoo and placing the label dialogue on what you just described.
Yeah, dialogue. I like that too.
And my takeaway from all of that, there's many, but I'm going to choose one.
Okay.
Is you are here to observe. I like that. Susan's taught me to leave everything at the door and let the animal in front of you lead your behavior now. Or as Jill Fernandes would say, be dumb.
I know. It's a terrible way of saying it, but for me, it works. I don't know. Maybe it will work for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone's an individual and everyone has a different thing that works for them or doesn't work for them. Step 1 was understand the natural history of the animal. Step 2 was to forget yourself and step 3 is to pay attention. So fantastic, Jill. Your 3 ideas and your stories and your lessons have been incredibly insightful, as expected. Unfortunately, though, we've reached our final question for this episode. I was wondering if you could please take us all on a journey now into the future and share your vision for the next 5 to 10 years in the realm of animal welfare.
Really, my vision for the next 5 to 10 years, and because I'm impatient, I'm probably like, it's going to happen in 2 years. But realistically, 5 to 10 years is that on the research side, there will be so much more research coming out about animal emotions that will help us make sense of what, you as trainers are already observing on a day-to-day basis. But the neuroscience will be there. And it is already emerging and already backing what you guys are observing as trainers, and that the research will come out and we'll have a better understanding of animal emotions. So that would be great to see. I would love to see that. On the applied side, my vision is that everyone becomes an animal welfare scientist. Basically, that everyone feels that they have the knowledge and the skills and the tools and the confidence to assess animal welfare on their own, on a one-to-one basis with an animal, and to respond to what the animal is saying. That is what I would like to see, and that's basically where all my efforts focus, is providing that education and encouraging people so that they feel that they're ready to do that. Telling them what they should be focusing on and what they should be learning to make them better observers of animals and better responders. So that's my goal, is that everybody is out there critically thinking on their own, and that they feel equipped and empowered to be an animal welfare scientist.
Well, I think I like that. I love the critical thinking aspect of it, and I think it's a journey that we are approximating towards yearly. So whether in 2 years we are there in all of our organizations and farms and dog shelters is something that time will tell. But I think we're definitely approximating quickly in that direction.
Yes, I think so. I see a lot of people are interested in it. And I think that's because we naturally, have we're drawn to animals and we want to understand them. So it's great. We just have to create good shaping plans, Ryan, to help people become better equipped to do this.
Couldn't agree more. We deeply appreciate you sharing your experiences with us today, Jill. Before we conclude, though, we touched upon this earlier, but could you kindly remind our listeners where they can learn more about you and your work, or how they might reach out to you?
Yes, you can reach out to me at jill@animal-centric.com. And you can find out more about Animal Centric and about the work we do, and also just articles and resources on animals and animal welfare at animal-centric.com. So, and yes, please feel free to reach out to me and ask any questions. I believe that, you shouldn't have to do a master's or a PhD in animal welfare to be an animal welfare practitioner or an animal welfare scientist. So I'm happy to help anyone who wants to advance along their journey. So please do reach out.
Amazing. And we'll be sure to include all links for everything in the show notes for our listeners. Jill, this has been a delightful conversation. Both I and our audience are deeply appreciative of your time and joining us today. Your contribution is greatly valued. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ryan.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behaviour geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much, everyone, for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.